Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast, a weekly podcast whose mission is multifaceted. Each week when you tune in, you will find episodes that question best practices, challenge music education dogma, facilitate conversations about touchy topics, demonstrate pedagogies, and conversations where colleagues learn from each other. This is episode 300. The reason boys don't sing that we don't like to talk about. 3 years ago, I released an episode that got me called the Joe Rogan of Choir Podcasts. I was branded a men's rights advocate, and I watched a non-trivial portion of the choral community throw up their hands in collective outrage because of an episode, in part, that you're going to hear today. What was my controversial crime? I dared to argue that boys are underserved, and in many educational and arts contexts, even marginalized. And even worse, I suggested that their plummeting participation might actually be our fault as educators. And I don't mean someone's individual fault because of bad behavior, but because of collective rhetoric, messaging, and unintended signals. When you bring up the boy crisis in education, the knee-jerk reaction from within arts and education spaces is usually to point outward. It is to blame culture. It is sports culture. It's general societal pressure. It's Andrew Tate. These complex problems do not have a single cause, and they also don't have simple solutions, but what we desperately avoid talking about typically within our echo chambers is the climate inside of our own house. So over the past few decades, education and art circles have developed a deeply complicated and at times hostile attitude towards traditional masculinity. After all, it is the source of the patriarchy. In an earnest effort to make our spaces inclusive, we have often sent out an unintentional but crystal clear signal to what I would call completely innocent 14-year-old boys who are traditionally masculine. And that message is who you are naturally is something that we need to fix, tone down, or leave at the door. And then we act surprised when those same kids choose the weight room or the baseball field over the choir room or the theater classroom. If a participation gap this wide existed for virtually any other demographic group in education, we would be holding emergency national symposiums to fix it. Boys are falling behind across almost every measurable academic category. They are 6 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, 3 to 5 times more likely to be expelled, and represent 2 to 3 times as many suicides. They are reporting historic levels of loneliness. These are famous issues being discussed by people, not just me, and books are being written about it, but it is something that, of course, if you're a choir director, you see these things happening in real time. Yet in our choir world, we keep telling ourselves comfortable myths. The cop-outs are usually related to something about puberty and something about how society teaches toxic masculinity, etc., all of which conveniently pushes the responsibility away from our own messaging, our own rhetoric, and our own biases. We pretend to lose 13 to 15-year-old boys simply because their vocal cords are stretching. But ages 13 to 15 happen to be the exact window when adolescent boys report feeling the absolute maximum pressure surrounding their identity and masculinity. If we think a drop in pitch is the primary reason they run away from singing, we are completely blind to what is actually happening in their psychology. Around that same time, I gave another controversial presentation and an episode about the many flawed ways we tend to discuss diversity in our field. In that presentation, I polled a live audience alongside over 150 directors online about their intersecting diversities of opinion. One of the questions I asked was specifically about the use of gendered language within our choral group contexts. Before we dive into the main interview today, I am going to start this episode off with a quick audio clip from that presentation, which is on the feed still as episode 143, revealing the results of that poll. If you go to the episode, you'll hear that and many other questions from that poll. And the answer might surprise you. And that brings us to the episode today, which is a reposted episode because I believe that you need to listen to it again. Or I'm also banking on the fact that most of you here on the feed currently weren't on the feed 3 years ago. And so you didn't get a chance to hear this episode. It is with an expert guest from outside of the choral space, and you all know how important I think that is, to go outside of our expertise to seek relevant expertise. Is Dr. Brendan Kwiatkowski. Brendan is a researcher who specializes in adolescent boys' relationships with their emotions and identity formation. This is the ideal expert to ask this question. Voice change experts are great. Those are important. But this is actually the operative question. And his first response was that choir teachers wouldn't have anything to learn from him. And I, of course, quickly corrected the record on that. So we're going to try, as always, to set aside the buzzwords and your personal opinions about which are the correct cocktail of magic words to be using on this topic related to gender and gendered language, and we're just going to have an authentic conversation. You're going to get a chance to hear it between Brendan and I, which is a repost of episode 141. That's a long time ago on the feed. And I hope you'll just listen and be challenged by this episode. And of course, as always, every episode we do here is an attempt to start a conversation. Not to try to get under anyone's skin or to cause them to feel uncomfortable, but it's because I think these are important conversations. I believe that the boys that we are missing in our hallways are just as important as the ones that actually show up to our choir classroom, and I think we need to be including this in that international conversation in our art form. So stick around, and then afterwards let me know what you think over on the Choralosopher's Facebook page, and then you can also subscribe for free at choralosophy.substack.com, where I'm going to be posting the introduction of that controversial diversity conversation that I gave at Colorado Music Educators, along with a blog adding more context to where some of the brand that this show has as a controversial show that offers these harmful opinions. I think a lot of those buzzings around the choral community come from this time period where I was really digging into some of these conversations, and I'm not done because they are still important. So stick around, and I do want to know what you think. Your music program or event deserves a platform that does it all, without the extra costs. With Ludus, you get seamless ticketing, built-in marketing, powerful fundraising, and volunteer management, where volunteers can sign up, schedule shifts, and track hours with ease. Need to sell merchandise and concessions in person? Ludus Retail lets you log sales by each group, track inventory, keep everything organized. Hosting music lessons or theater camps? They have a classes feature, which makes registration and student tracking effortless. And it's free for your organization. Thousands of programs already trust Ludus because they help you focus on what matters most, the performance. If you haven't already, I really think it's time for you to ditch the bulky sight reading books, the paper, all of the things that are already in the kids' folders in your classroom because it's not customizable to what they need in the moment. Sight Reading Factory allows this and so much more. And then the work we do in the classroom can be customized to what they need in the music and the repertoire they're learning, and it can be customized to their current learning level as a group. So use the Choralosophy checkout code, Choralosophy. When you check out, it'll give you a 10% discount every time you get a membership for yourself and for all of your students, which is really, really important so they can do this at home. The last 2 years on the Choralosophy podcast have seen the biggest rate of growth by far for audience members deciding that they want to chip in every month. We are up over 260 people out of this audience every month that don't just listen for free. They send in $3, $5, $8, all the way up to $20 a month over on patreon.com/choralosophy or on the free Substack, which they then voluntarily upgrade to a paid subscription. And those 260 plus people are why I am able to do this show on a full-time and on an ongoing basis for you. This is why I can plan, I can make commitments, I can upgrade my technology so that the show always looks good and sounds good because we have such an engaged, amazing audience here. Shout out to the Inner Circle and patron level folks over at Patreon who choose to go above and beyond every month. Chandler Smith, Rebecca Chalk, Aaron McCullough, Joshua Ognanoff, Isaac Brooks, Nick Bobe, Michael Herron, Kyle Peterson, David Kowalczyk, Max Jackson, RJ McCracken, Kyle Siddons, and Stephen Kathy Kakachik. Now, it's interesting because I see more variation here in how people are describing themselves in terms of sex and gender than there is in terms of the racial category. So lots less variance in how people describe themselves, the language. A very high percentage of the people on the race question used the big five colors. I do think that that's just interesting and worth. Oh, good. This is good. One person put Nunya beeswax, and I agree. This was for science people. I'm trying to just get an idea of what's out there. Now, staying on the gender topic here, the next question: how should we handle gendered language in addressing or communicating with groups? Now, this one I think might anger some people, or at least be a wake-up call. I hope it doesn't anger anyone because it shouldn't. I've asked this poll. Now, I've done this question in several Facebook groups and got very similar results every time. So this one carries a little bit larger of a sample size. And the question is, how should we handle gendered language in addressing or communicating with groups? The choices are, again, you could quibble with how many choices there could be here. You could ask different questions, etc. But the ones I asked were, we should work to be more sensitive with how we use it, meaning gendered language, considering the people in the room. Another choice is eliminate it, all gender neutral language all the time. with our ensemble. So the question is about with our groups, right? And then the third choice is it's not a big issue. Use gendered language if that's what you're used to. Okay, so the majority answer by a lot also would be my answer, which is work to be more sensitive with how we use it and consider the people in the room. I've made that argument on the show before. I'm taking a little bit of heat from it, especially in episode 141 about masculinity. That was interesting. So the percentage there is 73%. That's the biggest separation in any of the polling questions. It was on this question. 73% of respondents put themselves in the we should be more sensitive in how we use it and considering the people in the room, whereas only 16% were in favor of eliminating all gender neutral language when talking to groups. And I just point that out because that perspective, though, is the one you would think is the majority perspective when you look at the public conversation about this. And luckily, because I disagree with this one strongly, luckily only 11% said it's not a big issue. I do think that just anytime you're talking about being sensitive to other people's needs and emotions in your classroom or your choir, it's a big issue. So I think we should be sensitive to those things, and I'm glad that that was the most common answer. Okay, everybody. I am here with Brendan Kwiatkowski, and Brendan, I found, as I find oftentimes fun experts to talk to on a variety of topics, on TikTok. And I came across you, Brendan, with a video that you did. Actually, the very first one of yours that I saw was about the term toxic masculinity. And you had a really interesting perspective on that term as being not super prescriptive of an actual solution. And I thought that level of nuanced thinking was really interesting. And then I just kind of dug a little bit more to find out that your main area of research is dealing with teenage boys and their relationships with their emotions. And so for everybody listening to this, I sent the invitation to Brendan to come on the show. And I just thought this was really a fun way to start the conversation. Brendan's response to me was, are you sure choir teachers would want to hear from me? And of course, I responded, oh my goodness, yes. This is the existential crisis in the profession of music education right now, is how do we get boys to feel comfortable with themselves enough to actually want to sing in front of people? We can get girls to do it. It is really hard to get boys to do it. And so that's kind of where this conversation is going to start. So Brendan, welcome.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I really love that angle. That I had a moment, I guess, of blinders on, of seeing things from one perspective and being like, oh, what do I have to offer music teachers? But then I realized when you mentioned that boys and relationships with band and music, that totally was actually something that even came up in my own research. Plus, I've come across it in other research as well.
Why don't you tell everybody first kind of who you are, where you come from?
Sure. I'm from the outskirts of Vancouver, Canada. And I was a high school teacher for 5 years before doing my PhD. In that time, I was a high school teacher. I did my master's in special education and came across the statistic that 81% of students diagnosed with emotional and behavioral disorders are male. And at the high school I was teaching at, I went on all the designation list and I counted and it was like, oh, that's the exact same percentage of boys in my school diagnosed with behavioral disorders. And so then I went into an investigation as to why is that the case. I ended up developing a year-long social emotional intervention for grade 11 boys that had a notoriously bad reputation at the school. And then from there's multiple life events being impacted by the suicide death of some students that I've taught. And just, they say all research is me-search to a certain extent. And I think on a subconscious level, my research into teenage boys' relationships with their emotions, with the sense of what it's like to be a man and their relationship with school, that reflects my uncertainty about and my difficulties about what it was like to be a teenage boy as well. And the research shows that is such a pivotal time period for teenage boys in their identity formation, and their social circles are changing. There's all this development, there's puberty, and then you add in social media now, and there's just so much going on. And we can look at who are the guides for boys these days, all these other things. But yeah, led me to my research, and now I'm in this weird space of finishing my PhD and trying to decide what to do with it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Now, I think probably a good place to jump into this conversation first would be that when you talk about your interest in researching boys and young adolescent boys, at least in my area of education in music, one of the things that we hear a lot right now is we are very kind of steeped in the idea that we should be trying to divorce ourselves as much as possible from the category of boy and girl anyway, and be as gender neutral about everything all the time as we possibly can. And what I'm was thought provoked a little bit by watching some of your videos is you seem to obviously think that there is something to research that is very boy specific. Talk to us a little bit about how you think of that and how you draw the line between, say, differences between boys and girls on average versus the fact that not everybody conforms super easily into one of those categories. How do you think about that?
I think that brings up a huge and important point, is that sometimes I think we can talk too much about gender in the sense that when you ask people to think about like boys and girls and the differences, people will generally revert to more stereotypical views, where if you just present people as people and don't have the division, the categorization ahead of time, people will actually have a lot more equal and egalitarian perspectives. So people can be primed towards thinking more stereotypically about gender, which is why, like in my interviews for my PhD research, if I'm asking them what it's like to be a male, I only introduce that into the conversation like halfway through the interviews, because I just started what's it like to be human, what's it like to be a teenager, and then I emphasized, okay, all those things you said to me, do you think being male had anything to exacerbate any of those issues for you? So in that sense, I think we have this tendency to emphasize too much about gender, about the difference between boys and girls primarily, when there's far more in common amongst all genders.
Yes.
Even if we're not talking about biological differences, if we just acknowledge the socialization of boys and girls is often dramatically different, then I think it's really important to still hold the categories. It's important to understand and investigate the categories of what boyhood is like, what girlhood is like, because sociologically, there is huge and major differences in the development between boys and girls. And of course, where people get into huge debates is how much is biological determinism / essentialism.
So I've been teaching for 20 years, and I've probably had somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 male students in my life. In my world, it's skewed, less boys than girls.
What would you say the ratio is?
It's about 2 to 1. So 2 girls to every boy that oftentimes will take high school choir, and that's actually a really good ratio. So like I actually have more boys than most of my colleagues do. And what I notice is that there are, here's kind of how I think of it. Yes, there's debates, and I've read into some of them, and I've participated in some of them about the biological causes versus the socialization causes of some of those things. It seemed to me that there's always some combination of both of those things involved in a lot of human stuff. But also at the same time, I don't really care, because ultimately, like, the kids come into my classroom with the needs that they have, and I would have to have some major blinders on to not notice that my boys need different things than my girls do. In almost every case, with the acknowledgement always that those are averages and that there's always exceptions, and like to those behavioral needs and emotional needs. I know, for example, my boys need to move around. If I want to keep their attention, I need to have them moving around the space a lot more. And in general, my girls don't want to. They're shy. It's something that I have to coax out of them. So it's interesting to me just to kind of think about, like, is it, in your mind, a meaningful category in the educational context, regardless of what causes some of those differences?
Yeah, I think that is exactly what I would want to say, is that gender is important to teach about, and like whether it's trans, non-binary, boys, girls, because people of those different categorizations have unique experiences, or they have experiences that are greatly impacted by their gender. And so to acknowledge that is really important. And it can get restrictive when people say, look, all boys are that way, and they have to be that way. Like, that's what I would want to stay away from. But I think it's really important to address the categories. And I know in Canada, there's only one university that has a teacher program that teaches about gender in education in their actual teaching preparedness program. And I was fortunate enough to teach that for one semester during my PhD. And so, yeah, I think that, and if you want to look at I also like a psychological lens as well. Students have transference with different teachers, assuming that you're a male educator, and you can interact with different students differently, and they will have different experiences of you based on your maleness. And that is something that, yeah, it's like to not acknowledge that or pretend like that doesn't matter would be missing out on like how humans interact and engage.
But the big kind of topic that I want to get your take on is that with the kind of what I would call a crisis of young men and boys in our culture, in our society, especially in education, falling behind girls in many ways, falling behind girls more than girls were behind boys. 100 years ago, when girls were told they didn't even have to get educations because they would just marry somebody, and that kind of thing. That to me is kind of alarming. And I wonder how, if we don't kind of treat young boys like a meaningful category, how do we help them? That's where kind of my tension in education is, and I wonder what your ideas or thoughts about that is.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that. Like, for instance, there's always a part of me that when we talk about the boy crisis and education specifically, that generally speaking, like, no group is a monolith. Like, boys tend to be some of the highest achieving, but they have a lot average on the low end. If you look at Canada, if you compare graduation rates between boys and girls are like 3% more likely to graduate. But then if you look at Aboriginal Canadians, then it's like a difference of 8% or 10%. So it's much larger than the gender gap, is like the racial gap. So those are other important factors to consider in there. So when we talk about the boy crisis in education, it's where I'm always curious, where do people point the finger as to what is responsible for it? So there's one large body that says schools are over feminized, with just, it's elementary school especially, so many female teachers. And then there's some other people that would point more to like boys and their peer groups especially, and what is considered like popular masculinity shies boys away from pursuing certain academic subjects or subjects deemed too feminine. Often the humanities, band, music sometimes can be associated in that as well. Mm-hmm. I know languages, French can as well. And then there's another perspective that's like, is this actually a problem? Because yes, the amount of female students that graduate and go to university is like quite a bit higher than boys, and boys have higher dropout rates in university as well. But then if you follow women after they graduate, and this has to do with often having starting families or getting married, like their careers, they feel more of a time pressure to do things quickly before they have kids, or things like that. Whereas men can sometimes go a bit later in, or there's some career opportunities like in the trades that is dominated by boys and men that don't necessarily need a graduate diploma. So like those are kind of a lot of the different nuances within that discussion. But I think that there's for sure, and like when you look at like in the States, boys are 6 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, depending on the state, like 3 to 5 times more likely to be suspended, expelled. There is something that is worthy of attention. Mm-hmm. The 2 to 3 times more likely to die from suicide. The lack of connection that starts, like lack of close connections, intimate close connections that starts in their teenage years. And then we're looking at like a epidemic or pandemic, whatever, of men that are more lonely than they've ever been in their lives. I think there's a lot of reasons to be concerned, and to just, that's not obviously why I'm doing this research.
If you've been dreaming about taking your student group on a trip, your choir, but you want it to be more than just a bus ride and a performance, you should check out Kaleidoscope Adventures. They've been planning exceptional student travel for more than 30 years, and they specialize in creating experiences that are both musically meaningful and logistically smooth. From performance opportunities to workshops and clinics, the Kaleidoscope Adventures team handles the details from start to finish, so you can focus on your singers. If you're ready to plan a trip that truly fits your choir, visit mykatrip.com or click the link in the show notes. No, it's okay. You actually answered it really well. That was definitely the type of thinking that I was going for there, to try to hear your thoughts on that. And it's tangential to what was my next thought was going to be anyway, which is it your experience, because it seems to be mine, and I just want to bounce this idea off you and see what you think, that young adolescent boys, especially right after puberty, and in those first few years after puberty, in my experience, seem to identify and take a bigger chunk of their personal identity out of the idea of being seen as manly and seeing as a man, as girls do, being like with words like woman or womanly. They seem to be more okay with girl, whereas young boys, they want to be seen as a man, like real fast. Is that out to left field, or does that seem like a reasonable
that checks
observation?
out with my research? And
okay,
Yeah, sorry for interrupting
No,
you.
you're
Yeah,
good.
that definitely checks out with my and other research. I interviewed boys 17 to 19 years old, mostly in grade 12, and they all said, without any discrepancies, that like the age from 13 to 15 was the most difficult in terms of when they felt the most pressure to be masculine. I'm not sure if you know any boys that like force their voices to be lower than
Mm-hmm.
before they hit puberty.
Yep.
But that, yeah, it's something I come across quite a bit. And so they found that those years, because there's like, one, it's puberty, there your body's changing, there's all this insecurity, you're going often transitioning to a larger school. Developmentally, it's the first time in children's lives where they become more concerned or they look for approval more from their friends than they do from their parents. And so there's all of these changing factors that happens in adolescence, and there's more social figuring out in those early high school years, according to the boys in the research. And then by the end, they felt like there was some relaxing, that there was a bit more acceptance, like grade 11, grade 12, of boys that kind of being themselves. And this is when I hear the boys like regretting not taking music classes, not trying things that they felt like it wasn't cool enough, and they didn't have the confidence to do it earlier on in their schooling years.
Yeah. No, that is exactly what I see. In fact, it's anecdotal because I'm not a scientist. That's what you do, but I'm just a teacher. And so anecdotally, one of the experiences that I had recently, about 4 years ago, was that for many decades at my school, we had a class called men's choir. It was called men's choir, and it was when I was in that class, I went to this school. I grew up in this town. There were 100 boys and men in that choir, grades 9 through 12. Then, of course, our town changed and more schools grew in, and so the numbers kind of shrank down. But about 5 or 6 years ago in that class, I had anywhere between, depending on the year, 50, 60, 70 boys in that one beginning. It was beginning ninth grade choir. Then, in an effort to be inclusive, our school district required that we changed the name from men's choir to tenor and bass choir. And since that time, our numbers have fallen by more than half. And one of the things, and of course, nothing is single variable that would cause that to happen. But one of the things that I noticed, and it's the reason I asked the question about do boys identify with those terms more, is because I feel like in my all-girls classes, or mostly girls, because we have some non-binary kids in there as well, that change to a more gender-neutral, almost what I saw as a net positive. But for the boys, it was a culture killer. Because like when you're coming out of 8th grade and you're looking to choose a class to take in high school, because of that need to be seen as masculine, I think that men's choir on their course sheet was my biggest recruiting tool, and they took it from me and named it something neutral, which for the boys in that age group, like they could see, like, yeah, I could be in a men's choir. I don't know about, I don't know what a tenor bass is, but like I could be in a men's choir. That'd be cool. And we lost that. And I really think it had an effect on their choices of courses.
I think that's entirely plausible. Yeah, that I could definitely see that as being something that would get a certain demographic of boys more likely to do it. And so then you have to weigh. I've also been in experiences where things have been divided by gender, and then some students could feel isolated or not seen, or that's not true of their identity, and then they don't feel like they belong.
Yeah.
So it's this tension about like it reminds me of my research and other research that the boys that were the most emotionally expressive were more often than not quite athletic and like almost more the jocks in the school. This jock has such a negative connotation to it, but they were definitely like more elite athletes at the school. And two reasons. One is that they felt that the sports themselves, excelling at something, gave them confidence to be who they are, but also they had less negativity. If they were to challenge their gender norms around emotions, they were still really respected as being manly enough in other sectors. And so, and a lot of schools, at least where I am, they pit sports against music, where like it's hard to fit band in with some of the sports timetablings and scheduling there. So often students have to choose. But there's this acknowledgement that appealing to some established norms of masculinity, and I'm not saying in a harmful way, but that some sense of being a man, which most boys connect with that idea, at least, of like wanting to be a man in a positive way, that will have an effect on enticing boys to join the program.
Yeah.
I could
No, I
definitely see
totally
that.
agree. Yeah, that actually brings up I mentioned right as we signed on your thoughts about toxic masculinity versus other types of masculinity, because you mentioned like certain aspects of masculinity that are not necessarily harmful, but they're common and they're in people's minds and in people's socialization. So would you share a little bit about with my audience that maybe hasn't seen your TikTok yet, because I will put it in the show notes, but that your thoughts about why that term isn't super helpful, especially when we're talking about, the sports bros and all those things, that culture in our school.
Yeah, I would say that toxic masculinity I don't find helpful because it's not nuanced to actually describe what's going on. And because it's not nuanced enough or it's used too broadly, then it loses its power as to what is the actual harmful aspects of harmful forms of masculinity, and then what could the positive ones be. And so like the research shows that there's like three main beliefs that if you hold these beliefs rigidly, this leads to the most negative outcomes for boys and men themselves and for other people in terms of like sexism, violence, things like that. And that's to be self-reliant, like don't ask help from people, do everything yourself, limit your emotions, restrict your emotions. And the third one is the desire or the need to be dominant. And that one I don't defend. Like needing to be dominant is very different than being an assertive leader. Like those are qualities, but like the actual desire to be dominant or to need to dominate others, I don't think that's very redemptive in my own view. But the other ones about being self-reliant and being emotionally restricted is I recently presented at a high school for graded boys, and I kind of like tricked them. I asked them, is it ever good to be those things? And they all thought the answer I wanted to hear was like, oh, it's never good to be those things. It's like I think educators want students to be self-reliant, at least in their classroom and learning and things like that. So there's good qualities about being self-reliant. There's good qualities about restricting your emotions in certain settings, but it becomes harmful when those are rigid and you are then unable to express your emotions in contexts where it's safe to do so, or you're able to ask for help when it's safe to do so. And I'll give an example from my research is that there was this boy who was bullied for like 5 years in middle school, early high school, and he got into like probably 5 fights a year. No friends during that time period, but he said that his ability to fight back, which some people might label as toxic masculinity, trying to solve their problems with violence, he didn't initiate it, but he always defended himself. He said that gave him, at least he held on to his own self-power during those 5 years. That like, yeah, he's like, I don't fight anymore now, or like, that's not great, but I still feel like that was in my context and in my situation, which was more survival based, that was really beneficial. And so I think toxic masculinity needs context, and restrictive masculinity, I think, gives more context. And it shows why things can be harmful because they restrict who you are and who other people can be. And now, actually, since that TikTok, I've been introduced to what I think is the flip term of what is the positive masculinity we should be going for. And I think that the positive masculinity we should go for is a connected masculinity. So we're connected to ourselves and we're connected to others. And if we look at other people, like we help other people, like a good leader, a good person also empowers other people to be themselves and to be connected as well. So that's kind of my thoughts on the terminology around toxic masculinity.
Right.
The main opposition I have is when like there was a lot of people that said like, but there are some things that are higher rates associated with masculinity. Like let's talk about like rape culture or rape perpetration, things like that, which is like that. If you don't call that toxic, then that is too gentle of a term. And so I guess I view restrictive masculinity as like an upstream, like this is like kind of more of the root cause that unchecked and rigidly adhered to when people are shut down off of their emotions, when they think they need to be dominant, then that can definitely lead to toxic behaviors.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of where I was going to go too, is like that's like rape perpetration would be a good example of what I think it would be fair to call a toxically masculine behavior, in the sense that it's mostly men that do it, and it is toxic. But then again, you're being more specific, which is where those types of terms are always better if you're being specific. I think we tend to we use those terms as these wide sweeping, very, very broad, I don't even know what you're talking about types of, I hear people use, I would say people use terms like toxic masculinity. They use terms like white supremacy. They use terms like misogyny, all in a very similar way. And that where we like what exactly is being talked about here, I'm not really sure. And so I agree with you in the sense that it's better if we take the terms and we boil them down rather than the buzzwords or the lingo that we're using, and think about the actual behavior itself and in what way is it useful, what way is it harmful, what way is it adaptive, or maybe even like you said, connected. And just to play devil's advocate, I would say that if your idea about connected masculinity, when you were describing that, maybe somebody who doesn't see, maybe somebody who's a little bit more of a modern gender theorist would be thinking about, well, but everyone should be connected in those ways. So how does connected masculinity serve as a useful term when really everybody should be behaving that way? How would you respond to that?
There's a big debate even in the field of masculinities of whether we should be striving for positive masculinity or just positive humanity, like positive humanness. Like, and that's an interesting debate. Like, some people are afraid that if we talk about positive masculinity, then that will just end up being more rigid and restrictive as well, being like, okay, generally people think of positive masculinity as like responsible, integrity, a man of leadership, integrity, all responsible, all these things. But it's like, does that mean then women aren't able to be those things? And I definitely don't think that. So I guess I lean a bit on that debate, as I think that masculinity or being a male, just like femininity, and has meaning for people. For some people, I think for non-binary people, it is liberating to not be in those boxes. But for some people, being connected to like, this is my masculinity. Like, if we go back to Carl Jung, like the Jungian concept is of like femininity and masculinity is like the anima and animus, which is like the belief that all humans have both the feminine and masculine divine or energy inside themselves. And I know for a lot of people that are extremely feminist, I know some of them that shy away from any of that Jungian stuff, and some that just personally find it really empowering to like visualize themselves as having both types of energies inside themselves. Whereas some people, like, I think the goal is just to not be restrictive in the way that you go about thinking about these things. About like, do you think that if women are more nurturing, does that mean that boys and men can't be nurturing? Or how do you define that? And I think that often is where people's stereotypical ideas actually falls apart if you actually challenge it on a day-to-day level.
Right.
But going back to what you said about terminology as well, like you mentioned, like white supremacy, all these things, is that about having precise definitions. If I'm allowed, can I swear on your podcast for a moment?
Yep.
Okay. One of my favorite titled articles I've ever come across, academic articles, is called Fuck Nuance. And I'm someone who loves nuance. And I think nuance is super important with terminology and things like that. But the argument from this article called Fuck Nuance was saying sometimes you can get so into the minutia that you cease to see what the actual issue is here. And so I would not like if someone took even restrictive masculinity and really liked that and was like, okay, it's all about the individual level, like this person's relationship with emotions, blah, 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 without still holding on to the acknowledgement that on a grand scale, like, men commit 90% of all crimes, of violent crimes and things like that. Like, there's sometimes where you need to see the forest, and there's other times where you also need to focus on the trees, and like people's individual psychological experiences are those trees. And so I think this argument on social media around terms, like, and even like the term like wokeness, has been like weaponized and used, and like I would say it's been intentionally taken from what was originally a Black term to now being like, no one quite knows what it means, but everyone has ideas of what it means. And so it's a way that language is used, and language is weaponized. And one of the weaponizations is making it meaningless by what it initially intended to do. It's kind of like,
Thank you, Mr. Derrida. That's deconstruction. That was the purpose of Derrida. Yeah, it's a horrible book. Don't ever read it. But it's the idea that if I can make the word mean, not only I can make it mean A, but I can also make it mean B. And A and B are opposites. Then I have nullified the word. I've made it meaningless. And you can see that with a lot of words. And that's not really the topic of this podcast, but it's an interesting thing that I think you just hit the nail on the head. A lot of these terms, you're right, when they're social media terms, we've got one side that uses one definition, one side that uses essentially the opposite definition, and they're arguing with each other, and that means no one knows what the other one's talking about.
And academics are some of the worst people for this. Like, you go to a conference and they just, either they define their terms for 10 minutes before talking, which is actually probably helpful, or they spend the whole time talking, but they're not really arguing about the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this tension of like, I want to use a term that actually helps humanize boys and helps humanize men and allows men to also help understand what's going on with them. If my term doesn't do that, then I don't want people, well, that's not my
What do you think
term
about,
to say.
what do you think about the term liberated masculinity? And the way I would maybe, this just came to me, I had not thought about this before, I was just thinking about this just now, meaning that it's okay for me to identify with being masculine and being a man and being having masculine traits, but it's also okay that my conception of that is different than yours, and I'm not going to get my definition of what it means to be a man from you. We each have our own way of interacting as men in the world. And that part of my masculine confidence, you might say, comes from the fact that I have my own, and I don't need your approval for what that means. Thoughts?
I love how you explained it. So yeah, in that sense, it's like, I'm not sure how much the term matters versus just how people make meaning of the term, which reminds me of my Reformation class in high school about like Erasmus and Martin Luther talking, and Erasmus said, you're not going to just create two churches, you're going to create thousands of churches if you break off from the Catholic tradition. And then that, sure enough, that's what happened. And the thing is, there is so many ways to be a man.
Yeah.
Like, there's not just one prescriptive notion, as much as we want to cling on to those ideals. And I think studying history is really significant. I always use the example of cowboys, because we think of cowboys as really rugged masculinity, kind of appealing, like the Lone Ranger type thing. But at the time that cowboys were a thing, is that they were not respected as men in societies, which is why they were called cowboys, because they were known for their aggressiveness, their impulsiveness, their gambling, and they weren't the traits of what a respectable, mature man would be at the time. So it's just interesting how definitions change even in a relatively short period of time. But we often think that the way men have been is always the way men have been.
Right.
Or the way that people want men to be, like the strong, tough, not wearing feminine clothing, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think as educators, we think about how some of these ideas are, easy for you and I as adult men to talk about, because we've been through some of these changing periods in our life. We've already been through puberty. In many cases, I saw on social media that you're a dad, I'm a dad. You start to have a developed sense of your own identity as independent from other men and boys. But when you're in puberty and in those years immediately after, I don't think that we've yet figured out who we are. This is true of girls too, but in that you just kind of unique space of the expectations that are put on boys at that age. I think that maybe kind of in the last few minutes of our talk here, if you could just kind of think about some of the highlights of things that came up and insights that came up in your research when you were talking to all these boys, just about some of the more interesting things or conversations that you had, or maybe even things that you didn't realize about being a boy until you went back and researched it later.
First thing that comes to mind is how lonely generally the boys were and how desirous of connection they were. Have some boys I talked to said, like, I just want a hug, not like a romantic hug. I just want like a person to care and to hug me. Boys who, and I feel like people may have the wrong impression, like, oh, I'm just talking to loner boys or boys who are isolated. It's like, no, I'm talking about boys that have a lot of social groups and friends that are just still lonely. And I compared the least emotionally restricted and the most emotionally restricted teenage boys. And even those that were emotionally restricted had this desire to connect more to their male friends. And the highly emotionally expressive boys, generally speaking, had what I called emotional safe havens, primarily with girls in their lives, with female peers.
Yep.
But those boys still desired and really wanted their male friends to be part of it as well. But they also still felt stuck about, like, oh, some of them felt like, I'm not sure if my male friends are ready for that or will actually do that. But when I'm reading everyone and talking to everyone, it's like they all want connection. There's not one teenage boy that does not want connection. And the most humbling thing for me is that I kind of expected that when I talk to the most emotionally restricted boys, I thought, one, some of them would say, oh, I've always been this way. This is just the way I naturally am. And that was not the case. All of them remembered what time period, or a specific reason of why they started to restrict their emotions. And I also expected that they would kind of just be a bit more emotionally unintelligent, if I'm completely honest. But that was not my experience at all. From talking with these boys who are highly emotionally restricted, there's a good argument to be made that they were almost more aware of their emotions because they were so concerned and so aware of other people's emotions and their own emotions of not expressing it. So yes, they did have their shut down emotions, but it's not like they didn't care about their emotions. They thought about their relationship with emotions a lot, even if they didn't necessarily express their emotions.
And so we don't see that.
Yeah.
We don't see it. Yeah.
And this blew me out of the water. Like, I know that there might have been some priming because we were talking about emotions in our conversation at some point in our interview. But at the end, I asked them, we talked about school a lot in my research, about their experiences of school. I didn't even actually put it in my PhD because I ran out of space. But then I asked them, if you could change one thing about school, what would it be? 95% of them said having actually adequate emotional education. One of my favorite quotes is, I know nothing about emotions. Even girls, I hardly know anything about girls, but I know like nothing about emotions. And so they all want better or more emotional education. And the things that currently are out there, they just said, if they got it, they felt, one, either shamed that they need to be more emotional. And like, why are you not sharing your emotions? You need to share their emotions, which I would say doesn't actually reflect their experiences. Because if you understand why boys don't share their emotions, you're going to have a lot more compassion and understanding of why they don't. So there's different ways to encourage boys to open up, but you have to be gentle about it, not like shaming them for not opening up. And
they're skeptical. I was going to sorry to interrupt that. I'm just going to say they're skeptical oftentimes that they're safe to do it. And that's partly why it's tricky.
Yeah, they question about whether people actually genuinely want to hear their negative emotions and whether they'll regret it afterwards. And research shows this. The only thing worse than not sharing your emotions is sharing your emotions with someone who responds terribly. Like, it makes more sense to hide your emotions if the person that you're going to share with responds terribly. And that's why I encourage adults, educators, students as well, when I'm talking to them, is that if you do not even have a safe person to share your emotions with, can you be your own emotional safe haven? Can you feel it within inside yourself? Can you notice your emotions going on, and can you process those maybe quietly in your room, or not quietly, just privately in your room? Yeah, and that's tough work. I know that often an approach, like, people care. Education systems are caring more about social emotional education, I would say. But from boys' perspectives, having someone do an assembly to come in and motivate people about emotions is not a thing.
That's, yes. In fact, earlier on, you talked about the debate between the guys and the boys, young boys and men falling behind due to a feminization of the school system versus other types of causes. These are the types of things that kind of give me the thought that there's some credence to a feminized school. And as I said before, I don't really believe in any like single thing causing all the things. Like, it's always a combination of things. But oftentimes in schools, if we try to get boys to open up or feel their emotions, we do it in ways that works for the girls. And very rarely do we alter that approach specifically for the boys. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that too, partly because we're thinking about, well, they're all just the same anyway, which we talked about before. And the other part of it is that there is, I think, a little bit of, within education, there's a little bit of hostility towards masculinity, if I'm being honest. I think sometimes there is and I think this goes back to what we were talking about before, boys tend to be rowdier, boys tend to get in trouble more, and I don't think it's conscious, but I think sometimes what happens is, in the back of our subconscious, we think, well, if we can get the boys to be more like the girls, then the school will run just like a whole lot better anyway. And I think some of these come out, some of these things come out subliminal. Thoughts?
I think there's a lot of merit. I would frame it that schools are more geared towards compliance, and
Sure.
girls tend to be more
Yeah.
compliant. And so that I think is the case.
I've got you thinking.
Yeah, no, you have. Like, I think that I understand your question and what you're saying now.
Mhm.
And I think the more unexplored people's ideas of gender are, and teachers' perspectives of gender are, the more likely systems and schools and teachers are to perpetuate more gender stereotypical things. And so I think you're absolutely right in that a lot of these things are subliminal, which is why I think we need to have teacher education that is about gender, to like acknowledge, it's like, oh, I actually do treat the boys in my class slightly differently than the girls in my class. And not saying, just notice that, not saying it's good or bad, but depends on like, how is that actually impacting different things? Like, are you giving your male students more physical freedom in the class? And if so, maybe that's great for all of your students to actually do. And like, maybe you need to encourage some of your female students to actually break out of their boxes a bit more. So yeah, I think that raises a good point. I still view it as compliance centered.
That makes total sense.
Generally speaking, teachers, what's the easiest class to manage is when students aren't bringing up when you have a class of your band teacher, like what, 60 kids?
I'm a choir, but yeah, I've got my biggest class is 95, and it's boys and girls, about half and half. And then, like I said, I have the all boys, the tenor bass choir used to be called men's choir, and then I also have girls' voices also, and they're all separated out by class until they become older.
I know a couple schools around me that brings up a good point back to your men's choir group. Is that there's some PE classes in grade 12, some choice PE classes, gym classes that are for women only. And the girls that take those classes just love the space free from boys, essentially.
Yeah.
And so, but like the school districts are figuring out like, what do we do with that as well? Because is there spaces that girls and or boys can exist that is beneficial to them, but also not ostracizing people as well? And so, yeah, I think that the conversation around gender is an important one, but it does, for teachers on their practicalities, I think teachers are dealing with a lot of these practicalities on the front lines.
Yeah.
Students to learn and to actually experience a relationship that's healthy and grow into human beings.
Yeah, and we're on the front lines. Teachers see these contradictions in the same way that you just brought up. Like, how do we get the space for the girls to be together and thrive in a way that seems to be beneficial to them, but at the same time not exclude somebody? That's a contradiction. The real world is messy, and we have these are things that we have to grapple with. And I think you and I have done that pretty well tonight. We're grappling. We're not answering and solving the world's problems here on the show, but we are grappling. So that I think that there's going to be a lot of people that find this helpful, and I appreciate your expertise and insight.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.
Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of a conversation. If you are still hearing my voice, that means you're one of the MVPs, one of the diehards, one of the real ones, as the kids say. So if you are willing on the way out to check out a few different ways that you can help me continue to make this show high quality. One, use the promo code. That's the biggest one. At Sight Reading Factory, at mymusicfolders.com, at mychoirropes.com, at graphitepublishing.com, and endeavormusicpublishing.com. All of those take the Choralosophy checkout code, and of course now the newest one is 3-Minute Theory. You can get a 15% discount when you enter Choralosophy at checkout there. And of course, going to Apple Podcasts and leaving a positive review is very helpful there, and sharing the episodes to your colleagues in real life and on social media. All of those things are incredibly helpful and allow me to continue to create this resource for you. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.